This program is brought to you by Globus.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Clarissa with your host for today of the discursive and knowledge sharing program Global Insight, brought to you by the Pan-African media in collaboration with Globus. And today we continue to look at the basic tools of international cooperation, trying to understand and our focus this day is on public relations and seeing how this can be a tool to build trust among nations of the world. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. As we can see, global differences and shift in, of course, alignment have seemingly put the world in a hard rock, challenging the concept of globalization, international cooperation, among others. However, we must find a common ground to reconcile these global differences, especially among superpowers, to circumvent further economic, political, diplomatic, and geopolitical turbulence as the world, especially in the 21st century, is undergoing some sort of global transformation. So we are going to look at public relations, which stands as a major solution to shaping international perceptions, strengthening diplomacy, and building bridges between countries and cultures. Therefore, public relations, according to the report, manages communication and relationships across borders. Public diplomacy, however, engages foreign publics. Strategic communication, therefore, pursues a defined objective. And we are also going to look at the differences between public relations and this information, which actually denote a deliberate act or the broadcast or dissemination of bias or unverified information, focusing on the founder of public relations, Edward Berner, who is seen as the modern public relations father. We are going to look at how precision, that is engaging consent, and of course we also highlight specific examples of that clarifies how states actually use public relations to shape their internal and foreign policies amidst the changing global dynamics. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to discuss this together with a panel of experts that will define the key terms, of course, highlighting the importance and also answering the very important question of should nations use public relations, because according to reports, people always limit public relations just to corporations, organizations. But today we want to look at the importance of this PR strategy to ensuring a cordial relationship among nations of the world, especially if we are going by the definition that the world is a global village, and to actually correlate in a complex multipolar society, it is imperative to exchange this, understand the public relations strategies and how it can help not to destroy but to build trust and solidarity among nations of the world. Just after the jingle, I will introduce to you the panel that will be giving us insight on this very important topic. You're welcome. Welcome back. If you are just tuning in, ladies and gentlemen, you're on to Global Insights this day, and we are on communication, public relations as a tool of international cooperation. How will this actually will help to circumvent the turbulence that it's already happening in the world of today. Without much ado, let's actually welcome the guest for today. I think we'll be moving now to Slovakia, and we're welcoming for the first time on this platform. We have the privilege to introduce to you Lucia Hubinska from Slovakia, lecturer in Design and Media, Institute of Creativity Innovation. It's a great pleasure having you on the Pan-African Media this day and precisely on Global Insights.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Good afternoon. I think the theme for today's discussion, which is public relations in global affairs, and with particular focus on building trust across borders, is particularly important because, as you mentioned, we live in a world in which communication has never been faster, it has never been more global, and it is absolutely very technologically sophisticated. Yet what we are witnessing is that international trust often appears to be deteriorating rather than improving. So public relations, however, in global affairs is often approached as though the central problem, however, were primarily one of communication. We see governments, institutions, and people misunderstand one another, and we aim to think that we need better communication strategy, we need greater dialogue, we need more effective public diplomacy, or more sophisticated strategic communication. It is true, however, I think it is only partly true. Communication certainly matters enormously, and the modern state has always depended upon the production, collection, and circulation of information. Today, with digital technologies, with satellite television, with social media, now with artificial intelligence, all of these global communications networks that we have at our disposal, we have the ability to produce and control information, and it has become increasingly important element of international power. There is also this very optimistic idea accompanying new communication technologies that you can also witness in communication scholarship, and but also amongst politicians in the last 2 decades. And that says that if human beings can communicate more easily, they will understand each other better, and therefore conflict will become less likely. Even more than a century ago, the Italian inventor of the telegraph, Guglielmo Marconi, he spoke about communication between geographically separated peoples as a weapon against misunderstanding and jealousy. And then many decades later, very similar promises accompanied the emergence of the internet. We thought that connectivity would democratize information, that it would bring societies closer together, and perhaps even contribute to peace. And that is certainly an attractive idea for many of us. But history tells us that communication technologies themselves do not necessarily produce peace. The same technologies that can allow people to understand one another can be also used for other means, such as surveillance, warfare, propaganda, psychological operations, or political manipulation. So radio, for example, as a medium connected populations across enormous distances, but also became an extraordinarily powerful instrument of wartime propaganda. The internet might work the same. It promised us a global public sphere, but it also became an infrastructure for surveillance, for polarization, for cyber warfare, or other types of manipulation. So in this sense, I would argue that technology itself cannot create trust. And I think that brings me to what I think is the central point that I want to try to make in today's discussion. So if we want public relations to contribute to building trust across borders, I think we first have to ask series of questions, critical questions, such as who communicates, who controls, or owns the channels of communication, who possesses these resources to be able to reach global audiences, whose voices are amplified, and on the other hand, whose are marginalized, and also whose interpretation of what is happening or the international events become accepted as legitimate. So
Absolutely.
this is where I believe that critical approach to public relations, which I am most aligned with this approach, becomes especially useful. And I hope to develop this during today's discussion.
Absolutely, it is important to answer the basic questions and see how communication should be used as a tool to build and not to actually divide a society. And of course, we are glad to have Arnold Lovely, international lawyer and also a political consultant, joining us today to share his insight on this very important topic, public relations, because when we look at the events which are happening, if we want to look at the Rwandan genocide, if we want to look at the past events that happened in Venezuela, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, we want to look at now the role of public relations in attaining such objectives, and of course to benefit who. And welcome, dear Arnold Davali, as we seek to have your own interpretation of the term public relations and its relevance in today's global affairs.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Clarice, for your invitation. I really enjoyed listening to Miss Lucia's presentation. It was quite articulate and very thorough. I would only add in that sense that communication as a means of exercising public relation is but a perspective as to where one speaks from. And in that sense, it is but a reification of one's own worldview very often. And if this worldview is predicated on incomplete education as to whatever topic is at stake, then it can lead to misunderstanding. We've seen this several times in how the chronology of certain events of our time is being somewhat segmented to fit a certain narrative and lead to the notion for some who might be impressionable that such and such thematic only happens to have its origins at such recent date, when in fact there is a whole context behind it. And so in that sense, I would look at public diplomacy or public relation as a two-edged a blade that cuts both ways, and it can only be well applied if one possesses all the facts, notwithstanding the topic at issue. So again, I echo my predecessor, and I hope to be able to develop this notion during our debate.
Thank you so much, dear Arnold. Let's go now to the Republic of South Africa, I think the Rainbow Nation, to welcome Good News Cadogan, a Pan-African leadership coach, and he's joining us today. Of course, public relations is a subject that has affected Africa since the dawn of time, because when the colonial masters came, they actually set a PR strategy, and to enjoy what Lucia and Arnold said, we'll see that the PR strategy actually played in the favor of the colonizers rather than in the favor of the African continent. What agenda did they set for the continent, and how is it still affecting the policies, existing policies, internal and foreign policies across the continent? So we are happy to welcome you this day, Good News Cadogan, as you share insight. But before we go deep into understanding some of the nitty-gritty involved in public relations, let's have your holistic understanding of the term in line with current, past global affairs.
That's a wonderful opening a way into this discussion. And greetings to my fellow panelists and to your viewers across the world. Right from the warm tip of Africa at the bottom in the south. My belief is that from a state perspective, there has to be some kind of a link between our constitution, using South Africa as an example, and the key messages that we drive. The founding principles of our constitution should frame the way in which we communicate. The founding values, and also the third one is more around citizen conduct. What kind of conduct are we promoting or are we discouraging from our citizens in order for us to get there? So in summary, I could say our PR cannot contradict our constitution, and we must communicate law enforcement and order on the one hand, while reaffirming the dignity and the non-violence that is associated with the behavior of our citizens. And then what I would like to highlight there, it's more of a balancing act. We can't do one without doing the other. We have to make sure that credibility is retained by having balanced messaging, and also to actually remove the kind of values that emanate from the past, as you said earlier on, that we come from an unhappy past, we come from an unsavory past. We have to kind of promote the kind of future we want to create insofar as the African Union is concerned, and also the Agenda 2063.
It's about setting the agenda that aligns with the needs of the nation. And we are moving now to Russia to welcome Yulia Berg, political scientist and founder Global's International Expert Club. It's a pleasure to have you once more on Global Insight this day, dear Yulia. And we're welcoming you to actually have your own understanding of public relations and how relevant it is, especially for nations, and the concept of international cooperation in a multipolar setting.
Yes, I would like to greet the panelists and you, Clarice, of course, as well as the audience of our today's broadcast. And the topic being discussed today is extremely important, especially given the fact that on the one hand, we're observing a situation when communication means and methods have developed quite a lot, and exchange of information has become instant. That's why a lot of political issues have also shifted to social networks, to instant message exchange, and quite a lot of regular diplomatic channels have been changing quite a lot, and we're observing a phenomena that is also called the Twitter diplomacy, right? When important public statements that affect markets, that affect behavior of millions of people, that affect their decision making, are simply made on social networks. And the era of long documents, well thought through communique being released in a very sophisticated manner is quite over. So we see how Trump's social network diplomacy is making him gain huge numbers on the market games and on stock exchange games and whatsoever else. So the impact of those technological changes is tremendous. Yet at the same time, we see that those technological developments on the use of internet, artificial intelligence, and so on, do not really serve to improve the quality of feedback coming from voters, coming from people, coming from citizens of countries back to the government. So in political science, those aspects of communication and institutionalized, non-institutionalized communication have been studied quite well by tens of brilliant minds, including Hannah Arendt, including many others, who have studied how government interacts with the citizens. What kind of methods could citizens possibly use to express their opinion on the policies being provided, and so on. But unfortunately, what we observe globally is that it's becoming quite a one-way street when this kind of technological development is not really serving to gather and articulate the opinions of the people in order to provide explicit feedback back to the governments. And I think it is very clear and obvious when you look at the current support ratings of many, let's say, European leaders. So European governments are experiencing a major crisis. If you look at ratings and trust ratings of Emmanuel Macron, if you look at trust ratings of Merz in Germany and many others, you would see that it's around 30% officially that do trust in the governments led by those leaders. And that's a major crisis. It means that the government and its policies, its decisions, do not really meet the expectations of the citizens who actually voted for them. And that's a problem. That's a problem because once you have this kind of gap between the two, between the people being governed, the government, it can last for a while. Yet at the same time, it would definitely lead to a major crisis if you look at midterm perspective. I think today we will have a great opportunity to discuss those issues and aspects as well. And the panel of speakers we have will be presenting their views as well. But I think in terms of the technological possibilities that we have and the way they're being used, one of the major problems is this gap created between governments and their own people, and misuse of that technology for manipulation rather than accumulation and articulation of people's actual needs, demands, desires, and so on.
Thank you so much. Coming back to you, Lucia, let's look at from Edward Berner. You understand that at one point he noticed that public relations actually appeals to psychology and somehow spur some sort of desire that is create some sort of perception among the audience maybe and internally and external audience. So let's try to understand this. Before going further, let's differentiate public relations from actually propaganda in this platform to understand better, because from what is very common out there, it brings people somehow into some sort of a state of confusion where differentiating public relations, necessary or strategic communications from governments or between governments and citizens, and even countries between countries, and propaganda with a different agenda in mind. Let's try to get the differences and then continue in the same perspective.
Yes, thank you, Clarice. And I also want to thank Yulia for this very valuable and insightful contribution, because she set the stage perfectly for what I wanted to say next, because she really touched on this disparity between, the PR strategy or what is being said and what is actually lived by people in their countries. So this is something that I want to highlight. Maybe I can do that later on, since now you have posed the question to differentiate between propaganda and public relations. And so I would try to elucidate this difference or this relationship between public relations and propaganda. I think that as much as some of the public relations practitioners or even academics would feel maybe a little uneasy or uncomfortable admitting that public relations and propaganda are much closer than we really sometimes pretend or think. Because today, in the 21st century, propaganda tends to be understood as something dishonest, manipulative, something that is always practiced by our enemy, our adversaries. Of course, propaganda has gained negative connotations because of its wide use during war times, such as the Second World War, and so on. So we always tend to take these negative connotations and then use the word propaganda, even propagandistically, to label or to dismiss some other uncomfortable opinions. And on the other hand, we have public relations or public diplomacy or strategic communications, which have been presented as legitimate forms of communication that are practiced by respectable institutions or, respectable and honest actors. But again, historically, this distinction was nowhere near as clear. And you mentioned Edward Bernays. Yeah, he's one of the foundational figures of modern public relations. And he always openly used the term propaganda. So he wrote a famous book in 1928, and it was called Propaganda. And it is nothing but a manual on how to do propaganda and how propaganda is indeed, very necessary and very essential in democracies even. So, and many of the techniques that are used by public relations and propaganda remain still closely related. They both may involve selecting information, they both involve framing, they both involve constructing narratives, they use emotionally powerful images, slogans, words. They will appeal to values, to historical memory, and they always attempt to shape how the audiences, how the audiences interpret reality. Of course, this does not mean that every form of public relations is propaganda, and even if you look into academic approaches, or even if you look at the normative approach to public relations, what we always strive is to differentiate public relations not just in theory but in practice. Okay, of course, the difference in terminology does not resolve any ethical problems or dilemmas. Calling something strategic communication instead of propaganda does not automatically make it more transparent or democratic. But much more useful distinction concerns, I think, the relationship with the audience, the relationship that each of these practices has with the audience, or the attitude towards the people. So genuine public relations, or the most excellent form of public relations, can involve and should involve dialogue, should involve negotiation, listening, and even allowing the organization or the government itself to change as a consequence of that communication, of that deliberation. That is, I think, the main distinction that we should make about public relations. And on the other hand, propaganda is much more likely to begin always with a more predetermined objective and ask, how do we make the audience to accept our objectives? And it's a very one-way communication. And even that distinction becomes more complicated in global affairs because governments communicate with foreign populations through public diplomacy. They will always obviously have strategic objectives. States are not willing to invest substantial resources in international communication simply because they want or they enjoy conversation. They want to they want to assert influence. They want to exert power. They want to influence how foreign publics, as much as domestic ones, perceive their country, their policies, their interests. And there is nothing inherently, controversial about recognizing this, but the ethical problem might arise when our strategic communication is presented as neutral information while we always label somebody else's strategic communication as propaganda. And this is that double standard that makes genuine international dialogue, I would say, extremely difficult.
And which is very difficult, and probably will appreciate if Arnold Davily, of course, from the maybe the ethical perspective, bring to light some of the parameters we can use to actually navigate the complexities of public relations. Of course, while talking earlier on, sir, you highlighted that PR depends on where you stand and who is speaking and for what reasons. So we are taking a case according to a report somehow in the 90s where a Kuwaiti teenager appealed to the emotions of in the U.S. Congress that probably was amplified by a PR company in the United States of America that alleged Iraqi soldiers removing babies from incubators, and this actually prompted some sort of a reaction from the U.S. Congress. Let's try to look at how we can maybe create that compromise and also handle the ethical risk of such circumstances that appeal to psychology and sympathy for a wrong reason, because according to the report, investigations later revealed that it was just a stage scenario.
Yes, and it is actually the dilemma is that we only find out about the actual truth once the consequences of those PR campaigns have exerted their intended effects, as you mentioned in this particular case, securing congressional approval for military action against the country of Iraq. But the problem is, over time, and despite the improvement of technological means, we've had more and more example of this blatant propaganda. And the same means are always used as far as securing public opinion. It's this demonization aspect of such and such a figure, most likely a leader of a country. And we've seen this happen, it's a recurring theme for the last 20, 30 years, I would say. To be sure, such method was used prior to 1990, but we did not necessarily have the excuse of knowing in the exact real time that such information being vehiculated was actually false. Whereas by now, we've had, in an increasingly shrunken period of time, recurring episodes of such methods being used to justify military action against the sovereignty of, X, Y, and Z countries. Of course, I don't have to revisit, the running period leading to the second war in Iraq, bearing on the WMDs and all those elements of languages that were peddled around back then, with the mushroom cloud and the 45 minutes drones, which could reach U.S. shores, and always the inflammatory statements made about the leader of the time, as we've seen also happen in Syria. Very connoted adjectives and epithets aiming to somewhat encapsulate one's means of administering his own country. Suffice it to say that this has to be taken into the context also of, I would say, a depreciation of public education and probably the rise simultaneously and in parallel of the culture of TV reality, which happens to coincide with the turn of the century. We all recall the phenomenon occurring about the turn of the century, and this is just about the time when the propaganda aimed at geopolitical advancement of some interest was basically unleashed with a vengeance. And so we have to ask ourselves what is being done to educate the public, because in the end, public opinion, as the name indicates, bears on public perception of what's being peddled. And if the public is not receiving proper education on general matters, including context, including historical record, then we are fighting for the framing. And the empirical approach might be found lacking because there are incomplete information across the board. And so that's the challenge, I think, in our day and age, is to educate the public in such a way that those techniques, those subversive methods, do not encounter and secure the same public support, at least on the margin, which enables, some governments to basically not only act against international law, but ultimately against the interest of their own domestic constituencies.
Indeed, and the challenge lies on how to educate the public when actually the public is so diverse, and with the advent of social media, it becomes very problematic, dear Nord, and of course there's still a way out. Coming to you, good news, Cadogan, I would love us to take this other question by actually contextualizing the situation in South Africa. Months ago, the Operation Dudula and other activists actually framed somehow in their PR strategy, demonizing or weaponizing some sort of, I don't know if we should call immigrants, and then primarily saying they are the reasons for their actually low level of or probably high level of unemployment. And then we want to understand how this PR strategy affected the image of the South Africa, and of course how the South African government is actually tackling this at this juncture to ensure some sort of understanding of internal policies. It's preserving its international image, and of course aligning still with the continent's stance on the agenda of the African Union that talks about the unity of the African people in every sense of it.
Thank you very much for that question, Therese. It has been quite a difficult time for South Africa as a nation, but also for the South African government to actually provide the right information. And as I said earlier on, South Africa is a constitutional democracy. And even though in the constitution, there isn't something there that says this is how government should communicate, but there is something around how our constitution has been set up and how then government, in this particular case that you are referring to, managed to use the tools on hand to actually respond to the crisis. In our constitution, firstly, it talks about the right to access to information. And if then that is the case, it means government has a responsibility to supply the information that will make people to make the right decisions around the crisis that the nation finds itself in. So government cannot hide. Government is supposed to share information proactively, so that it can help people to exercise their rights, like, for example, to question things around service delivery, budgets, health alerts, migration policy, which was the issue at the time. It still is an issue today. And also, a silence on these matters is unconstitutional. The second one is more around freedom of expression and media freedom as well. So to gag media, and even to gag people like March on March and others who were participating in these protests, it is something that is unconstitutional. But there are rights, the rights are not unlimited. So the right to freedom of expression does not give right to demonize, as you said earlier on, migrants and people that are in this country legally, so that in the end, they may be the target of either violence or hatred by different parts of society. The third one is more around accountability and responsiveness and being open as government. Government is supposed to do that. What this means is that public administration must be governed by transparency, meaning that information that is required must be timely, it must be accessible, and also accurate information must be provided to the public. Secondly, it's about accountability on the part of government. Public administration must be accountable to the public and make sure that the relevant information or communication is done in a manner, like said earlier on by my fellow panelists, the thin line between propaganda and public relations. Understanding that thin line helps, especially in times of crisis, so that in the end, it doesn't become a top-down kind of communication or a one-way kind of communication that pushes an agenda that is untrue. And lastly, it's more about our democratic values as a country, putting people first. So all of these, they are part of the founding principles of our Constitution. What it means is that government is founded on accountability, responsiveness, and putting people first. And secondly, communication must be in languages that people can understand. We have got about 12 official languages in South Africa, and we are obliged, or government is obliged, to communicate in those 12 languages to make sure that the information can reach everybody. So in the end, the Constitution doesn't ask us to do PR, but it commands us to be transparent, to be accountable, and also to be responsible and responsive as government. So government communication is not just PR washing. It's about meeting a constitutional obligation to communicate to the public in a responsible manner.
Absolutely, communicating in a responsible manner to ensure that the message is not misinterpreted. And we come back to you, dear Yulia. I would love to contextualize with Russia, where you are coming from. And we want to look at how Russia's public relations in recent times have been termed or has been coined in negatively as propaganda. And this I am saying categorically because myself have been somehow accused of being a Russian propagandist. But then when I look at the real definition of media relations, public relations and communication in the context of news giving, I see that I and other journalists, especially of the African origin, are within the ethical framework. But then we still see some sort of, framing that criminalizes what we do, or for what reasons I cannot tell. So we want to get from you as a Russian how the government is navigating such, especially in line with Russia's PR and its foreign policy, especially in Africa.
Yes, thank you for this question. And well, first of all, when we look at the definitions and the connotations and let's say meanings that are normally implied when we use this or that term, it gets really interesting. Because, for example, when we talk about propaganda, normally we perceive it in a negative way. Propaganda is something bad because it probably implies a very aggressive, a very active campaign on imposing some kind of agenda or narrative onto the audience, right? Yet at the same time, when depending on the object that is in the center of that communication, the meaning and the connotation can change to the opposite. For example, when we talk about propaganda of healthy lifestyle, propaganda of environmental awareness, propaganda of running in the morning. Probably the methods would be the same, or could be the same. Aggressive, you could see those banners all over the place saying, oh, go through medical checkups once in 6 months. Go run in the morning instead of just staying in bed till lunchtime, whatsoever else. So the methods used will be quite the same, but propaganda of healthy lifestyle will not be causing such negative reactions as propaganda of Russian narratives, right? So here we see once again that methods is one thing, but the core of communication or the main messages being transmitted is something else, right? Once again, when we talk about Russian propaganda, um, I think what is important to mention is that even when you compare the possible means or venues or communication channels, whatever Russia does in terms of the global media could never be compared to the possibilities and opportunities that the United States have, for example, or France or the United Kingdom. Even when Russia Today was still available, it was just one channel on satellite that was available in many countries of the world, but there is no way you can compare it in terms of volume and amount of information being transmitted. You cannot compare it to the power and might of BBC, CNN, all of the French channels being broadcasted all over Africa and all over the world. So I mean, when you compare the actual resources available and communication platforms and channels, what Russia was doing even before 2022 is probably less than 1% of the global media field, right? When you compare it in terms of audience and when you compare it in terms of numbers, right? In terms of measurable, clear things. So it's becoming quite interesting that after 2022, when anything related to Russia is being banned, canceled out, erased, or labeled as something extremely demonic, whatsoever else. It's quite funny when you actually look at those numbers and audiences, because it's just a little drop in the ocean, right? The information that somehow comes from Russia. So why would such an aggressive campaign and why would those unprecedented measures be applied? I mean, what's so scary, what's so threatening about it? The answer is really unclear. I mean, I don't have an answer to that one. The very same thing applies to propaganda through arts and culture and movies and whatsoever else. So there is no way you can anyhow compare Russian, let's say, movies at the global arena to Hollywood and its outreach. So everyone knows Hollywood as a brand. Everyone knows the movies that came out, and everyone is somehow exposed to propaganda that is being a part of those movies. But if you ask an average person in the street somewhere in one of the African countries or in Asia or in South America to name 5 Russian movies, they would really find themselves in a trouble trying to name at least 2, right? So in terms of outreach, in terms of audiences, you cannot really say that Russian propaganda is somehow or used to be somehow strong at the global arena. And it's one of the quite typical things, also because of the language barrier, also because of, some of the cultural differences. And, what I say sometimes to talk about Russia's public image or foreign policy in terms of, its communication. So mostly it's just nothing coming out from Russia. And then all of a sudden you see tanks and you don't know why, but there is a story behind it, right? So what I mean by that is that the soft power, the communication strategies where Russia is an active actor are not really a thing, and they have not really been so big even in the times of the Soviet Union when it was like peaking. So even in those times, if you compare, it was much less than whatever the United States and the West, generally speaking, used to be producing. In the 90s, it was nothing that was actively promoted from the Russian side, but even later, it's still a drop in the ocean. So definitely, it's not about quantity, but probably about quality or the core messages that are contained in that information or propaganda that are perceived to be so dangerous by the West that they have to be sanctioned and restricted and wiped out and erased from everywhere. Even now, when Russia is facing this hybrid war, I cannot really say that the approaches have changed much. So there is, you cannot really say that there is a some huge propaganda machine that is trying to impose its opinions. Yes, of course, there are attempts to at least get some information across, but you cannot really call it systematic and massive, right, in terms of that. So, well, in terms of foreign policy and in terms of communication strategies, definitely Russia is not a good example of, effective mechanisms, and it has never been, fortunately or unfortunately. And I think, well, in my personal or professional opinion, this is why it's so striking that there is so much pressure being put on anything that could at least somehow be named as Russian narratives. So that's my take on this issue.
Very important. Thank you for the clarification, of course. Let me come back this time around to you, Arnold Devely. So let's try to see how we can, use public relations effectively in line with shifting alliances or the new alliances being formed. And if you would actually want to elucidate more, especially on the importance of how public relations help to shape the changes happening presently in the Sahel region as we talk.
Yes, I wanted to actually add something to what Yulia mentioned, bearing on the so-called alleged inadequacy of the PR as carried out by Russia. Suffice it to say that, and I'll take a concrete example to illustrate. In France recently, we've had basically all the main cable news network being completely flooded with what is, by all accounts this time, Ukrainians propagandists. And we're talking about, dozens of them. And they basically get free reign to peddle their talking points. Simultaneously, we had a person who was the head of RT France when the channel first opened in 2017 until it was closed summarily in 2022. Her name is Xenia Federova, and she has been recently intervening on a regular basis on a cable news network called C News. And she also has penned a few editorials in the Journal du Dimanche, which is a weekly. And she basically gave the facts as everybody who's remotely following the conflict understands them. And she has not necessarily gone out of her way to inflame a public sentiment or demonize any kind of party to the conflict. She just simply rolled out facts that are easily verifiable. Well, for that fact alone, she was subjected to an arrêté, which is some kind of a decree, an administrative decree, calling for her to be deported from France, despite the fact that she's a legal resident for at least 10 years now. And this points out that sometimes quantity is not quality, and if quantity is actually right on the money in terms of giving the change to the ambient propaganda, the very nature of the measures that have been leveled up against her show that it can be wholly sufficient. And I would say I would extend this rationale to what RT has been doing for the last 20 years, along with channels like Sputnik. They've been making a difference. Make no mistake about it. This is why they've been banned, outright censored, if not outright canceled in many Western countries. So this being said, bring me back to your question again about how this can be applied to the model in sub-Saharan Africa.
The role of PR in shifting alliances, and to another extent, how it has helped even in the revolution in the Sahel region and elsewhere across Africa.
Well, again, this is all about basically making sure that the audiences understand history, not just going back to 2021 or 2020,
Sure.
but going back to at least the 1960s, if not the 1880s. If one understands the fundamental one-sided nature governing relations between African countries and their colonial masters of the time, notwithstanding the declarations of independence of many of those countries in the 1960s, one understands that sovereignty was never quite accomplished the way it should have been. And we transferred from one form of colonialism to another one, however more subtle, but which had the same result of basically fleecing those countries from their own resources. And so basically the reality on the ground today, when one understands and gains access to data bearing on what any one of those countries possesses in their soil, helps understanding when you see the wholly insufficient level of development of their own population, not to mention all the migration that are taking place to European countries. One understands that those independents were independence in name only. And so obviously people are trying to instinctively, if anything, reconcile the divide between what they're being told from revanchardist countries, such as the European countries, but not only. The United States has obviously their own sights set on Africa. And the fact that, in the end, the situation is such that there's got to be more than what people are hearing. So again, I think we need to trust the audience to understand certain fundamental tenets before rushing to say that we need more, means to communicate. We need to educate first and foremost, and education often goes through a repeating of elementary truth with data, hardcore data, not just opinions or editorial views of the reality, just hardcore data. And of course, I would say traveling and meeting with the people on the ground and getting educated by the people who know the situation the best. This is something that was mentioned at the onset of our conversation today. But yes, I believe that traveling beats by a mile any kind of rendering of reality in other lands that the televisions or the internet might, in that sense, provide. It would behoove every young student. I think the English has something called the gap year. It would behoove every young population of academic age to go and travel the world for a year and see for themselves the reality as opposed to the propaganda.
Thank you so much. Lucia, of course, we are asking the question today if PR can actually bring about trust across borders. But then when we look at it critically, we see that each individual, each entity, be it in a state or probably large corporations that do have stakes in some global decisions that have also general ramifications. We see that methods of communications do vary, and of course the agenda or the reason behind such communications. So we want to understand with you how these diverse methods of communications put the issue of trust on the line.
Thank you, Clarice. Thank you for your question. Before I answer this question, again, I want to touch on something you said maybe 10, 15 minutes ago when you were asking a question to Julia. Okay. You mentioned this issue of you being labeled as a journalist or accused of being a Russian propagandist. And then you kind of suggested that or to your defense, you wanted to highlight the ethical dimension of the work that you do as a journalist, maybe contradicting this or suggesting that there is something inherently unethical about propaganda. I want to highlight as a propaganda researcher that propaganda, just as public relations, is a communications tool. It's just a tool. So in itself, it's neutral. It matters more what ends it is being used for. Propaganda, or the term at least of propaganda, dates back to to the church and to the Pope somewhere in the 14th century, when Pope Leo XVI, if I'm not mistaken, founded an office for propaganda to spread Christian faith. So in reality, it was just about disseminating information, and it had been that for a very long time before these war times, when propaganda gained negative connotations. So what I always highlight, both in my research or in my teaching, is that it depends for what ends propaganda is being used. And yes, I do acknowledge the fact how we in the West, both in public discourse or in media discourse or even in Western academia, use the term propaganda itself propagandistically, how it has become a label that is attached to something that we find uncomfortable, politically inconvenient, or that we want to dismiss. There are so many examples, of course, in the Western media themselves. So instead of perhaps naming one, I would just say that the principle or the mechanism on which this works is you label something as propaganda, and therefore you want to distract from whatever propaganda you are going to say next. Sure. And that is the principle that is basically being used. From the perspective of from crisis communication, which is also part of my background, crisis, and if you consider, let's say, you being labeled a propagandist, a crisis for your own reputation or anything like that. Crises are perceptional. That means that whatever importance you might attach or how much you perceive this as a crisis, it actually becomes that, right? Crises do not exist objectively.
Sure.
So I think one of the ways in which we can kind of defend ourselves from, being labeled propagandists and therefore being seen as being evil or unethical, because all of us, in a sense, are propagandists. Communication is it's a goal-oriented activity. In every act of communication, you are trying to convey a message or to persuade your audience about something. So it is about not necessarily being so perhaps concerned about the label of propaganda, and maybe it's about starting to get this awareness about the term itself and saying, okay, I might be a propagandist, this might be propaganda, but that doesn't mean anything. It's just communicative tool.
Communication, yeah.
Now, let me return to your actual question, which was about trust and public relations. So, of course, here I would pose this argument that communication cannot be separated from the actual social and material relations or relationships that underlie it. So I will start from the position that you cannot maintain deeply unequal relations between countries or between peoples within those countries and then expect, a sophisticated communication campaign that will create genuine trust. You cannot impose economic pressure. You cannot impose sanctions. You cannot threat someone. You cannot want to politically interfere or coerce someone and then think that you will solve resentment that you created in the process through a better communication or public relations strategy or even your own nation branding. So trust is not simply just a product of communication. It emerges first and foremost from relationships. And exactly the same principle applies within or in international relations and within societies themselves. So if working people experience declining living standards, if there is growing economic insecurity, if there are declining public services, or people have a sense that they actually have a very little influence over political decisions that are being taken and implemented, then governments cannot permanently solve that problem by just coming up with excellent communication or just by employing better communication advisors. And here is where I'm getting to my point about European Union, because that provides a particularly revealing example of precisely this tendency. For example, the European Commission has an entire Directorate General for Communication, whose responsibilities include communicating the Commission's political priorities, running pan-European campaigns, managing its corporate image, monitoring public opinion, and informing the Commission about political developments and trends in public opinion. This Director General alone had an operational communication program of almost 115 million euros in 2025. Of course, this involved activities such as social media monitoring, following narratives, so social listening, that's a public relations term, connecting this to political priorities and developing strategies around implementing or around, convincing citizens about Commission priorities, which it describes as benefits the EU delivers for citizens. Slovakia, my own country, joined the EU in 2004, and ever since we have been subjected to constant communication, to constant propaganda or public relations or whatever you want to call it, campaigns about the supposed benefits of the European Union, to the extent that now, Slovakia, for example, is the second most polarized country in Europe because the opinions about the European Union differ so much, and no communication strategy cannot now conceal the material reality, however, the people are living. Okay, so of course, every political institution needs to communicate, and we have false information that might genuinely exist sometimes, but we should ask from a critical PR perspective, what happens when we have an institution that becomes simultaneously responsible for promoting its own political priorities, monitoring public reactions to those priorities, identifying problematic narratives around them, and then systematically developing communication responses to counter those narratives. And there is an obvious democratic danger here, because political disagreement here can very easily cease to be understood as some kind of political message from citizens to institutions, and instead it becomes interpreted as a communications problem that institutions must solve. So we have, for example, issues of people opposing a certain policy, and the reasons behind this opposition to a policy might be that this policy harms them, it disadvantages them, they believe that economic priorities are wrong. Workers might feel that they are paying the cost of decisions from which other or industrial workers or people struggling with the cost of housing and energy, and they have every reason to be angry. But what happens is that institutions increasingly view these responses and these dissatisfactions as, kind of pathologizing these populations, or thinking, oh, we might have just communicated this wrong, that people do not understand the policy, we have failed to explain the benefits, and so on. So what I would say is that the answer is more communication, more monitoring, more strategic campaigning, and more fact-checkings and more campaigns is what these institutions think is the solution. But this is not the right solution. For example, the Commission itself now describes foreign information manipulation and interference as a major threat, and it says that its response will include strengthening strategic communication, monitoring and analyzing information, and there has been a great deal of effort and resources poured into fact-checking initiatives and anti-disinformation campaigns. Okay, but where is this boundary? And that's where we are getting onto a very slippery slope, is that there is a boundary between protecting citizens against deliberate manipulation and constructing an information environment in which opposition to some institutional policy is increasingly viewed through the language of manipulation, misinformation, and threat. So I would say that, again, sometimes people are dissatisfied because their material circumstances give them very good reasons to be dissatisfied. And there is nothing undemocratic or wrong about this. Of course, this is the basis for democracies if European countries want to call themselves democracy. So I would conclude by saying that even the most sophisticated PR, propaganda campaigns, even the most well thought through campaigns cannot substitute for the material reality, and cannot defeat the lived reality of the peoples. We cannot tell people to enjoy the membership, let's say, of the EU if the people are genuinely dissatisfied and if they feel that their living standards are declining.
And that is where the problematic lies when the interest of the bloc comes before the interest of the entire nation, and the effects of such alignment and the overall performance, especially governance performance of the nation. If I should borrow what you said, Lucia, we want to look at how some PR strategies actually come now to pose a question. This I'm directing to you, Good News Kedogan. We want to look at where we have the intersection of national security, political interest, and also public transparency, when they actually stand in some sort of a crossroad, or probably at a conflict. How do you think governments can navigate this in terms of public affairs?
Beautiful. This is a great question, because it sort of touches on some of the things my fellow panelists have covered around the academic and professional description of what public relations is, and also how the term around propaganda can be used depending on how you see yourself as a communicator, as a state, and also how you are seen by those who see you to be propagandist, so to speak. I think there's three jobs that government has to do to ensure that that balance is maintained. One is to coordinate by aligning messages on shared issues, like, for example, migration, trade, security, health. This helps then the citizens on both sides to get the same facts, so that in the end, decisions on these matters are made on the basis of pure truth that comes from statistical and other means of sources that allow for citizens to make these decisions. The second one, after coordination, is around de-escalation. De-escalation comes in when government uses diplomatic communication to calm tensions when there's a crisis, to correct false narratives, for example, to prevent cross-border panic and even xenophobia, as we have experienced in different parts of the continent and also across the world. Even in Europe, there are accusations around xenophobia. And if there is not active government de-escalation in those cases, it means then that the conflict can explode to disproportionate levels. The third thing that I think government needs to do is to project the values. Like I said, that South Africa is a constitutional democracy. It means that we have to show, a government has to show that their foreign policy is grounded in what they say they believe in, not what they want to communicate on the go at that particular time. No, there has to be history in the past that what you are saying now has been true yesterday, it's true today, and it's going to be true tomorrow, because it is the essence of the belief system and the values that you hold dear. Like, for example, issues around human rights, the respect for human rights, the respect for rule of law, the respect for sociability and being able to connect as a society. In South Africa, we call it Ubuntu, meaning that I am because we are. It means that we criticize when we must and we cooperate when we can. That is the essence of projecting certain values. So in summary, I would say domestically, PR is how the state earns its trust from its citizens. And internationally, PR is how the state earns respect. And in both cases, it must be principled, it must be fast, use all the technology and the platforms and the frameworks that have been mentioned here, and it should also be rooted in truth, finally.
Indeed, or whatever it is, it should be rooted in truth to also ensure some trust among the government. With that said, we want to look at a point which you raised earlier on, dear Yulia. Of course, that pertains the rating of some global leaders. And the question we want to ask is at this juncture is to see how a state, or probably can a state, actually build and maintain a positive international image if its internal policies contradict public messages and the reaction from the population, as we continue to look at how PR strategies affect government, both in the respective nations and across other nations where they have some sort of relations or cooperations.
Well, that's an interesting question. That's an interesting question because on the one hand, when you talk about perception of, let's say, generally speaking, audience, it is to a great extent quite emotional. And in modern day public communications and especially social media campaigns and news campaigns, the ones that are intensified in order to either create an image of the enemy or justify some unpopular actions. The key method that is being used is the method, or let's say a set of methods that trigger emotions, right? So I mean, there is quite a good movie about it called Wag the Dog. It brilliantly shows how propaganda is working and how those emotional reactions are pulled when it is necessary to make sure that the electoral campaign in that case in United States is going as planned, and the audience's emotions are controlled. So that's the key target when we talk about PR, to make sure that attention of the audience is caught, controlled, and that audience reacts very predictably in terms of its emotions and in terms of actions that follow those emotions. So this is how this kind of control is being imposed. That's when we talk about media manipulations. But each campaign of the kind, sooner or later, creates, let's say, creates an effect when the audience feels like it either woke up or has sobered up from something that was artificially imposed on it, right? Because sooner or later, when the truth and the actual reasoning for this kind of manipulative campaigns come out, it is inevitable that there is this kind of reaction. For example, the recent case of Epstein has made a lot of people rethink what they were thinking about Hollywood and what they were thinking about their favorite actors that used to be guiding them through their life, and that people trusted as celebrities, as people with achievements and people who were supposed to have quite high moral and ethic standards. But what turned out to be the case is that there was a terrible dark side to this whole industry that has been basically tricking people into something fake for several decades by now. So when you talk about this kind of public relations and methods being used, of course, the most sustainable strategy is just trying to keep it real and being as honest as possible in any given moment, because this approach will not be creating too many after effects and will be quite sustainable within a long-term time frame. Yet at the same time, when the key objective is to manipulate people into some kind of an action, whether it's voting for a specific candidate, whether it's supporting some unpopular policy or decision or whatsoever else, you will see after effects that could unfold in their full capacity only years after, or maybe generations after. For example, if you look at propaganda in Germany, I mean, in the 30s and 40s, the Nazi Germany, the country itself had quite significant, let's say, achievements in terms of technology, in terms of science, in terms of many other areas. But the way they were applied to reassure own superiority, to impose methods that were anti-humane by their nature, and so on. I mean, that was a major abuse of technology, of science, of many other things that could have been serving much better purposes, generally speaking. But besides that, millions of Germans were actually raised that way and tricked kind of into thinking that it was okay, that the ideology of those times made sense. And the after effects came in later. And of course, for any human being who has lived with some kind of perception in their head, it's difficult to switch to the opposite completely. So I think that's why we sometimes observe those after effects even generations after. I mean, some of you might have seen this press conference held in Serbia when a German journalist was asking a question to Vucic and Zelensky, and he asked, "What can we do as Europeans to kill more Russians?" Just like that. Then he added Russian soldiers, but it was quite striking for many people, not just in Russia but in Germany as well, because even the word in itself is completely, unbelievable in its core, right? So a journalist asking how they can assist in killing people of a specific nation, what is it? And if you look at his own biography, and I mean, the story was widespread on the media. He has some ancestry that was active in terms of the Nazi regime and whatsoever else. But what I'm trying to say here is that the after effects of certain approaches are lasting in time, sometimes lasting through generations. And that's why responsible policies and policies that are focused around, truthful information, even when we understand that not all the information in the hands of decision makers is possible to release to the general public and whatsoever else. But the closer it is to reality, to the truth, the better it is for the upcoming generation. Because otherwise, when we create those illusions, those bubbles, even when the nations or their leaders are portrayed as after effects, would be significant, and they would definitely strike back, right? So many people are laughing now, or at least smiling, when they see Trump post on social media when he's comparing himself to superheroes, to movie characters, whatsoever else. And some of his comments when he says that, people say that I'm one of the greatest presidents. I mean, it does trigger a smile, but imagine if there was a big amount of his supporters who actually believed this to be true, right? And who were gathered around this cult. And when at the same time we're talking about a person whose controversial and unexpected behavior is one of the means of making money on stock market and let's say stock market and economic ups and downs. So there has to be quite a conscious approach towards that, and the more realistic the things are kept within communication, the better it is strategically. Yet it's not always as heroic, as sweet, as interesting, as sophisticated as many people would want it to see. But there is nothing better than reality in terms of that.
Indeed, thank you so much, dear Yulia, for elucidating on that, and which brings us to the last phase of the discussion, which actually centers on recommendations, the way forward. And with you, Lucia, now we touch on media relations, not on the part of government, but how journalists themselves, as communication professionals, can navigate, PR in such a way that will circumvent the existing discrepancies among nations, but then build, an atmosphere of trust. If we should refer to the last statement or example which Yulia presented about the journalists categorically asking a head of state how what they can do to kill more Russians, it now brings us again to this aspect of PR, which is media relations, and the role of journalists in actually, setting an agenda that promotes trust, that promotes solidarity and peace, in line with international relations, diplomacy, and even public policy among nations of the world.
Yes, so, okay, this is a question that I want to highlight, let's say, the state of, or comment on the state of journalism in the 21st century. What we are seeing, and because of this international situation, because of this very much changing world, the geopolitical, tectonic shifts that we are seeing, we are in the midst of information war. We have real wars going on, but we also have an ongoing information war that is involving all countries pretty much in the world. In such environment, I always say it is very difficult to let's say stay cool and stay somewhat distant or objective, because there are sides and there are interests, and they are exerting and they are using many resources in order to get their point across. It is not only about, of course, countries do not gain advantages just by military interventions, but they need to win the hearts and minds of peoples around the world as well. The role of journalists, however, if we want to go back to this traditional definition where media was seen as the fourth estate of democracies, as a guardian, as a watchdog of power, then the role of journalists should be to, of course, work in public interest, should be to provide accurate, objective, and unbiased information to the publics to inform them about what the governments are doing on their behalf and what is happening. So, however, this has not been the case for many decades now, if ever. There have always been interests that were somehow always prioritized above the public interest. And we can even refer to the canonical work in this media or in how media functions. And that's the work by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman, which kind of described, the filters through which all of the information that even journalists can discover or obtain, but how they are filtered before they actually get to the public, or when they get to be printed in the newspapers, or when they get to be broadcasted on TV. And these are primarily defined by interest, and most often these are financial interests in Western capitalist societies. So we are getting to the question of media ownership here. And media in the West function as commercial enterprises. There are very few media groups that own majority of the Western media news organizations. And of course, we will have these companies functioning as businesses that always want to maximize their profits, but also they want to serve as institutions or businesses that protect interests that serve their own interests, or protect groups and individuals that serve their own interests. So there are always these kind of questions that need to be taken into consideration. That's what I also started with. We need to look at who owns the media, who has the right to speak, for what purpose they might be speaking. So if we really want to, let's say, think of journalists as unbiased, most objective actors that are working solely in the public interest, perhaps we should focus on the question of media ownership, and maybe we should even reconsider these economic models or business models that media organizations today have.
Your great insight, and we come to you good news, Cadogan. Of course, we are looking at recommendations. We have acknowledged the importance of PR in shaping not just the nation's image, but also creating some sort of desire and perception. And I will still take an example that aligns with the agenda of the African Union. If we are in a revolution, a positive revolution today, where sovereignty, economic, political, and even social or cultural sovereignty is actually something of vital importance in Africa. It is partly due to a PR strategy that valorize or prioritize what maybe Africa first. So in your own perspective, while looking at how governments can maintain a good PR in line with their geopolitical standing, we want to get from you some sort of recommendations how to effectively use PR in this complex world where we see some sort of countries realigning and shifting shifting alliances, and also some sort of differences in balance of power and control, among other aspects.
it's a big challenge because Africa on one end may be a country after all, but on another end, Africa is 54 countries, stretching from Cape to Cairo, meaning that there are wide and diverse interests that must be taken into account. But succinctly, what I've been thinking is that African governments must communicate very fast. They must communicate in local languages and with one voice across borders on the big ticket items that affect the continent. I believe that truth is our best defense against panic, and Ubuntu is our best foreign policy. Why am I saying so? The challenge for Africa is that the state communication has to change. The speed comes in whereby misinformation crosses the borders in minutes via WhatsApp, TikTok, and radio. This creates a trust gap, and in most times, citizens trust their own community leaders more than government statements. So that's why that gap needs to be closed via speed. And also interconnectedness on issues like, for example, migration, health, security. These things may be a crisis in one country, but on the other hand, they may create panic in the neighbors of the very same country. So the bottom line here is silence is not neutral. In Africa, silence gets filled with rumors, and that creates the crisis that we have. Secondly, it's more about moving from reactive to principled communication, where speed and protocols are combined to create national rapid response teams linked to the African Union, linked to the regional bodies, where facts are verified and facts are then communicated in a very short space of time. It's about going local, I believe, using WhatsApp, using the vernacular, using traditional and faith leaders, and also to train, as has been said by one of our, if not all, panel members, training community peace ambassadors. We also need to coordinate across borders. That's what we need to do from an African perspective, and anchor our communication in constitutionality. If all communication is grounded in human rights, Ubuntu, the rule of law, and we admit the failures that we have as governments, it becomes easier to correct these errors publicly. And also to build into the state resilience of some sort, to invest in African fact checkers and digital literacy in local languages, so that you have a motto that says verify before you forward. Don't just forward things like most people do. So the outcome of what we want here, we want trust at home and credibility abroad. And home is defined from Cape to Cairo. If we do this, it means domestically, regionally, and globally, Africa projects itself as a stable, values-driven, and solutions-oriented continent. So in the end, in Africa, PR is not a spin. It is how we protect lives, how we uphold constitutions, and it's also how we practice Ubuntu across borders. That's all I can say for now.
Ubuntu across the borders and giving importance to the philosophy. I'll be ending with you, dear Yulia, and looking at how, because when we look at global transformation in the contemporary society, we attempted to say that it is actually under threat due to geopolitics of resistance, of course, and also some sort of alleged conspiracy theories that do undermine the smooth, transformation trajectory Gary. So now, can we use PR at this juncture, or probably if we can use, what are the right parameters to be handled in order to ensure that there is this that it mitigates the geopolitical tensions as a result of this shift, especially in line with emerging powers and traditional powers, and sometimes also reduce the conflicts where PR is somehow seen as a strategic or disguised strategic competition among superpowers. What are the recommendations? Unfortunately, we lost Yulia, ladies and gentlemen, and this is where we are going to put a full stopper on today's edition of the program, while reiterating that our focus for today actually discussed on public relations amidst the global dynamics, its importance, its relevance, and of course how it can be used as an international relations tool to bring about trust, to bring about connectivity and solidarity among nations of the world, because PR indeed helps countries to position their image, especially international image, and also helps to shape a perception of what people think or feel about their respective decisions, especially in line with foreign policy dynamics. It actually attracts to an extent new allies, new investors, tourists, students, and even skilled workers. Most important, or the relevance again of PR, it's a soft power that actually comes through culture, education, values, and diplomacy, and defend national reputation during conflicts or moments of crisis. It is on this note I will say goodbye to you, while wishing you a blessed moment as you stay in the company of programs on the Pan-African media, and wishing you a blissful weekend. Bye-bye.
This program was brought to you by Globus.